Our reading this week is in Joshua chapter 5. If you want to grab your Bible and head over there, we'll talk a little bit about it today. It's kind of an odd chapter from one angle because it almost feels like a break in the story, right? We do 3
Well, you're
and 4.
changing gears a little bit now.
Yeah, we do 3 and 4. We get across the Jordan and we're ready, to go start conquering cities. And before we get to that, we have this kind of odd chapter and to some degree an odd series of events. So basically 3 things in the chapter. You have the circumcision part of this that gets a good bit of discussion. And
most of the chapter, actually.
Yeah, and then you have the manna coming to an end.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, this interesting encounter. Let's just describe it that way, right? So let's talk first about the circumcision, which may prove to be an interesting conversation to have with your children as part of the Bible reading this week. So this is kind of a weird story. You almost get the sense that Israel's failed to do something along the way.
Well, that seems to be the indication. In other words, and again, it's a significant story because obviously the circumcision was the sign of the Abrahamic covenant. It was a crucial part of their identity as the people of God. You remember all the way back in Exodus chapter 4 when God and Moses had that run-in because Moses hadn't circumcised his sons, and so. I think it is meant to be a mark of their failure. In other words, so here's God who's been very faithful, brought them through the wilderness, just like he parted the sea, he's parted the Jordan, brought them across, kept his word, held up his end of the deal, and now, here we are, and before we can do anything else, as they're actually in the land, they need to actually look different than the natives, so to speak. They need to actually have the sign of their Abrahamic covenant with God, let alone the Mosaic covenant. And so something as fundamental as circumcision needs to be reestablished. They've been sloppy in the wilderness about this, apparently. And so it's a shame. And again, we're already setting up the book of Judges. Just God is the one who's faithful, comes through, does what he's supposed to do. And it's God's people who often fail to keep up with what they ought to be.
Yeah, and just because a commandment is neglected over a long period of time by a lot of people,
right,
does not mean that the commandment
went away,
is no longer relevant anymore. So can I go off track just a little bit and talk about baptism?
Well, sure.
Because I think sometimes we feel like the weird people,
right?
Still practicing baptism, still teaching the necessity of baptism. When by and large the religious world has
moved on
from baptism, and yet it is commanded by God.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, same kind of situation, God says to the people, I meant what I said about that.
Right. And you'll see this, elsewhere in the Bible, by the way, in Kings and Chronicles, in the days of the kings, where things like the Passover had not been observed for a long time.
Feast of Booths during Nehemiah's day had to be observed correctly.
It did, that part of that Mosaic covenant did not go away. Their job was just to get back to doing what they were supposed to be doing. And so that's exactly right. It's the original restoration movement, if you will, pardon the pun. But just, the commandments of God are in effect till God removes that particular covenant. And so you got to get back to what you're supposed to be doing and being.
Just because we neglect it doesn't mean it ceased to be important to
right.
God. Okay, so next piece of this, beginning down around verse 10.
Yeah.
We get to Passover. Mm-hmm. And verse 11 makes a big deal out of them eating the produce of the land, and then pairs that with, and the manna stopped.
Yeah. So the manna was meant to be that miraculous provision of God for them in the wilderness. And so especially, and I think it's significant that there's 2 parts to this. There is they started eating of the land, so you don't need the manna anymore. But beyond that, at the time of the Passover. So again, just like we had, the parting of the sea leaving Egypt and the parting of the Jordan coming into the land as bookends, the leaving, Egypt happens at Passover. And so the fact that they're now going to the land, so again, just the parallels between leaving Egypt, coming to the land, and continue. And so at Passover, it's also symbolically significant that season, that wilderness season, is over. A Passover began, and the Passover, in a sense, ends that.
Right.
And now, the manna ends as they literally are able to eat of the land flowing with milk and honey. And so, again, God's been faithful to his promises, gotten them through, provided for their needs, and brought them into the promised land.
Yeah, the fact that the manna has continued daily through all that time just served as this chronic reminder of God's faithfulness. And that's what's remarkable to me about that is when you think about some of the wilderness stories of their rebellion, on Korah's day,
Yeah.
the manna still fell from heaven.
When they were grumbling in that whole issue with the fiery serpents, you were still getting up in the morning. If you, I
manna
guess,
was still
dodge
on
the
the ground.
serpents, but you were getting your manna. That's exactly right.
How could you be oblivious to the implication of that?
Well,
I mean,
that's how we live every day, right? I mean, God's goodness constantly around us, and yet we grumble, we complain, and we even disobey. Even though at the end, as Jesus talked about, the sun still rises on the just and the unjust, the rain falls on the just and the unjust. The goodness of God each and every day to continue to provide with a creation that continues to function.
And should have a message to us.
But, we get so complacent about the constant goodness of God around us, it becomes invisible to us if we're not careful.
Okay. 13, 14, 15. Jeff has a pretty famous sermon that is drawn from the last three verses. That's probably not fair to say. You probably went all the way to Genesis to piece it together, but nonetheless, a pretty famous sermon. Do you remember the title of it so people can go back and listen to it?
I really don't.
Wow. It's a sermon about politics. So
yeah,
so
it was.
So why don't you share with us?
I remember that much.
The lesson you pieced together. It makes it a good time to talk about it now, too.
Yeah.
From 13, 14, and 15, which is just an interesting story.
It's a great story. And I think, first of all, because, chapter breaks are subjective judgments of humans, I think this story works better when we read it as actually the beginning of the Jericho story, right?
So he doesn't like chapter divisions. Just saying, just putting that out there.
Yeah, because really, the thing we forget about with Jericho is, and we get this on some level, but I think this part of it just all the more underscores that, here's Joshua who's gone out, to have a look, as it were, and as Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes, and behold, there was a man standing with a drawn sword in his hand. And he's the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. He identifies himself. And so the idea is that this conquest of the land was not going to be done in human strength and power. And Jericho, the fact that they just march around walls and the walls fall down is meant to be the symbolism of that.
Right.
Reminds me of the story in 2 Samuel chapter 5 when at one point in David's military efforts, God tells David to hold back until he hears the sound of marching in the treetops. The same thing in Elisha's day, right? When Elisha prays that the Lord open his servant's eyes, and when the servant's eyes are open, he sees the chariots of fire all around. This, we forget that the unseen realm is real. God is at work, and this is a reminder that the conquest of the land is going to happen under God's actual actions, whatever limited human role is played.
Yeah, that reminds me of Joshua's word to Israel the first time they tried to go up too.
Yeah,
because he and Caleb were the ones who were saying,
yeah.
The Lord will give us a victory.
The Lord will fight for us. That's right.
Yes.
This whole idea that it's the Lord who does the fighting. So yes, so
we're kind of revisiting that.
Yeah.
Here.
So literally, as Joshua is apparently considering Jericho as it's they've done their circumcision, they've done their Passover, they've kind of done what they needed to do to get on track and become ready to take the land. The commander of the army of the Lord shows up. And of course, the real important thing about that is Joshua. Two things are I think significant to notice in that conversation, that short conversation that happens. First of all, Joshua asks him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And in verse 14, famously, no. In other words, neither. The issue is not whose side am I on. The real issue is whose side are you on. The Lord is his own side, and again, that's just, that's probably why I did like to use that story for politics. We assume, God's a Republican or a Democrat or whatever, or try to moralize politics as though God is on one side or the other, when the reality is God is on no one side. The question is, are you on God's side? And everybody's got some repenting to do when it comes to that, when you frame it that way. And so, we don't put God in the box and put him on our side. Even Joshua had to be corrected about that. The Lord is the Lord, and your job is to be on his side of what's going on in history.
Didn't Lincoln have a quote like that during the Civil War?
Well, there was his famous second inaugural where he does allude to the whole idea that both the North and the South are reading the Bible in a way that justifies their side, praying to God for victory over the other side. And Lincoln's point is, the Lord is judging all of us in what's happened. And the reality is, we are all paying the price for the nation's involvement in slavery, and there really were no clean hands.
It seemed like there was some quote from him that, that it's not us to pray that the Lord will be us, but to pray that we will be with the Lord.
Yeah, I mean,
The
yeah,
same
yeah.
kind
He's
of idea.
certainly seen of any American president. He seemed to be the most understood. It's a mistake to invoke God on your side and to realize that really the Lord is doing what He will, and our job is to be humbled before that. Yeah,
So one other thing about 15, again, another echo. This is an echo of Sinai,
correct. That's the other thing that's worth noticing here.
which is Moses' sort of inaugural, right?
Yes.
When he starts.
Yes. Yes. And so again, because Joshua's not Moses, he's not going to be a covenant bringer. He's not going to represent God to the people in that way. And yet, even though, back in chapter 1 when we started with Joshua, the Lord giving Joshua that encouragement, that speech that he's going to go with him and so forth. This intimate encounter where, the only reason that he's got to take his sandals off, this is no mere angel then or such. This is in some way, the presence of God himself in this commander of the army of the Lord. And so like the burning bush, you're right. This is meant to be an echo and Joshua's, because Joshua's role is, in a sense, per his name, salvation, to actually deliver the people into the land. He's not a covenant bringer. He's a people deliverer. He's a people leader into salvation. But still, even as a human, it's not him. It's God with him. And so he has to take his sandal off and assume the same posture before the Lord that Moses did.
Interesting.
For all his greatness and for all that the Lord will do with him, he has to assume the same posture, that it's the Lord and the Lord alone, and that, this is a holy place. And so know your place.
So it's a fascinating chapter. Again, kind of a break in the action, it seems, from the conquest portion, but a lot of interesting stuff going on.
Well, this is the essence of the conquest. God is showing, and now I have come.
Yes, I am here.
Yeah.
Well, especially I like putting the break back at verse 13.
Correct.
To lead into Jericho.
Correct.
Yes, because you begin with God.
Yeah, that's right. That's the point. That's the point. The reason the walls are going to fall, nobody dies. It's just really them showing up to do the cleanup, slaughter the inhabitants and take the wealth, and burn the city. No, take the wealth rather. It's because God did the hard part. He, again, we're not used to ancient warfare. We're used to our air power, American military air power, missiles, whatever. Ancient walls were a big deal to get through and to breach.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
so the fact that the Lord did the hard part of breach, that was militarily speaking, a human capital endeavor. You'd lose a lot of men trying to breach walls. And so the fact that they just fall down and there's no real loss to Israel in this assault, because this is the Lord doing the fighting.
So if you want to pursue that'll take you into chapter 6.
Yep, and get us ready for next week.
Get us ready for next week.
Get us ready for next week.
Okay, so chapter 5 for this week. Good time to pause and at those 3 segments and take note of the powerful lessons that are there.